The first time Liam Park made me an offer, it wasn't for a job or a contract, it was for me. The ballroom was wrapped in gold light, chandeliers spilling warmth over people who didn't know my name and didn't care to learn it. I was just the translator they'd flown in last minute, a shadow in a rented dress, standing at the edge of the CEO's table. He was in the middle of a toast when he turned to me, glass still raised, and said, loud enough for the nearby tables to hear, $1,000 for a kiss on the cheek. The laughter that followed wasn't kind. It rolled over me like champagne poured too fast, spilling without apology. My cheeks burned, and I gripped the clutch in my hand as if it could anchor me to the floor. Then, before the sound had even died, he added, 10,000 if it's on the lips. The room seemed to freeze, not in horror, but in anticipation. Phones tilted subtly, eager to record, to share, to twist. His eyes didn't leave mine, as if daring me to react. Somewhere, the string quartet hit a wrong note, and I felt every gaze like a spotlight. I wasn't sure what was worse, that he thought I'd play along, or that everyone else thought I might. I took a slow breath, forcing my shoulders back. If Liam Park wanted a performance, I would give him one, but not the one he'd paid for in his mind. Liam's smirk was the kind people wore when they believed they were untouchable, polished, effortless, the kind that made onlookers lean closer just to bask in its arrogance. I could feel my pulse in my fingertips, but I didn't flinch. Is that your way of negotiating, Mr. Park? I asked, my voice low enough to make him lean in, though every nearby ear strained to catch it. A few guests chuckled under their breath. Others pretended to be fascinated by the champagne tower, as if the liquid gold could wash away the tension. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he tilted his head, studying me the way a cat studies the space between its paws before pouncing. It's my way of making the night memorable, he finally said, his tone dripping with something between challenge and curiosity. The spotlight glare of the chandelier above us made it feel like a stage. Cameras were already out, subtle but not subtle enough, and I knew by morning this would be clipped, captioned, and devoured by strangers who knew nothing about me. My stomach tightened, but I reminded myself of the one truth that had kept me standing in rooms like this. Power shifts fast if you know where to push. I smiled, just enough to make him wonder if he'd gotten to me, and reached for the champagne flute in front of me, not to drink but to raise. Then I'll make sure you remember every detail, I said. His smirk faltered, barely but enough. And in that fraction of a second, I knew I'd just taken the first piece off his game board. The room felt like it had shrunk, though I knew it was just the circle of eyes tightening around us. Liam took a step closer, not close enough to touch, but close enough for me to catch the faint trace of expensive cologne layered over something sharper, like adrenaline. So, he asked, his voice pitched low, almost a dare. The seconds stretched. I could hear the clink of glasses, the soft thud of the band's bass line bleeding in from the main hall, but none of it reached me. My mind was busy calculating. What would make him regret trying to turn me into tonight's spectacle? I let my gaze drop to his tie, perfectly knotted, a color that looked handpicked to scream CEO. Then I lifted my eyes back to his, slow enough for him to notice the deliberate pace. You'll have to try harder than that, I said, not smiling this time. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was loaded. One of the guests coughed. Another whispered something that made the person beside them stiffen. Liam's jaw ticked, and for a flicker of a moment, his eyes softened, not with kindness, but with the acknowledgement that I'd just raised the stakes. That's when the flash went off. 1, then 2, maybe 3. My skin prickled. This was no longer a private exchange. It was ammunition for anyone who wanted to watch a giant fall, or rise. Liam leaned in just enough for only me to hear, careful. You might get exactly what you're asking for. And for the first time tonight, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. The first crack in Liam's perfect composure came sooner than I expected. One of the photographers, emboldened by the tension, called out, Mr. Shaw, should we expect a wedding announcement tonight? The ripple of laughter that followed wasn't kind. It was sharp, the kind that cuts. Liam's shoulders stiffened, but his gaze stayed locked on me, as if answering them would mean acknowledging they mattered. My pulse hammered, but I didn't look away. Instead, I tilted my head, letting the question hang in the air like perfume. Sweet, intoxicating, but dangerous if inhaled too deeply. That's when a waiter, oblivious to the moment, slipped between us carrying a tray of champagne. Liam moved it aside with a flick of his wrist, never breaking eye contact. "Depends," he said, his voice a slow burn, "on whether my offer is accepted." Gasps rose from the circle. Someone actually dropped their glass, the fizzing sound oddly loud in the heavy silence. I could feel the weight of the room's curiosity pressing in, like they were all leaning forward, waiting for me to crumble or deliver. My fingers itched to grab a glass, just to have something between us, a shield, but I kept them still at my sides. "And if it isn't?" I asked, letting the question slice through the air. He smiled, not the charming, boardroom-perfect smile I'd seen on magazine covers, but something darker, almost predatory. Then he said, "I'll just have to make a better one." The way he said better made the hairs on the back of my neck rise. This was no longer a game. The crowd waited for me to flinch, but instead I stepped closer, just enough to invade his air the way he had invaded mine. "You think everything has a price, Mr. Shaw?" My voice was low, but it carried, slicing cleanly through the whispers. For a heartbeat, he didn't answer. His hand was still at his side, the faintest curl of his fingers betraying that my nearness wasn't something he'd planned for. "Not everything," he said finally, his tone less sure, like a piano note that had gone slightly flat. I could feel eyes darting between us, measuring the distance, the tension, the stakes. A woman in a sequined gown murmured something to her partner, who shook his head, never looking away from us. The heat between us wasn't romantic, it was a standoff. Two players testing the rules of a game that hadn't been explained to anyone else. I let my gaze flick to the $10,000 figure scrawled on the corner of the menu card between us, then back to his face. "Maybe you've underestimated the cost," I said. That earned a sharp inhale from someone behind him. For the first time tonight, Liam blinked first, a subtle break in his relentless stare. I could almost hear the mental note he was making. She's not going to fold. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might give me away, but my feet stayed planted. The room felt smaller now, like the entire party was inside this charged bubble, waiting to see if either of us would move, or if something bigger was about to explode. I leaned in just enough for him to think I might accept the bet, then stopped an inch short of his cheek. The whole ballroom seemed to hold its breath. "Tell you what, Mr. Shaw," I said, my voice steady but loud enough for every nearby phone camera to catch. "I'll take the $10,000 if you donate it to the children's shelter on 8th Street tonight. In writing. Right now." A ripple went through the crowd. I'd flipped the game without warning. Liam's jaw tightened, the smirk fading like ink in water. He wasn't used to being cornered in public, and certainly not with something that made him look cold if he refused. His gaze darted to the circle of watching guests, some of them already filming, others whispering his name with a mix of curiosity and awe. The pause stretched, tension sharp enough to cut. Then, slowly, he reached into his jacket, pulling out a sleek silver pen. "You drive a hard bargain," he murmured, but there was a flicker in his eyes. Respect, maybe, or calculation. I handed him my napkin, the only paper within reach, and watched him scrawl his signature beneath the amount. The cameras clicked like hail hitting glass. He handed it back with a slow curl of his mouth, the crowd parting to make space for our locked stares. For the first time, I realized we were no longer playing the same game. He was studying me like a move he hadn't predicted, and I was no longer the one being tested. Whatever happened next, it was clear. I'd just shifted the balance in my favor. The donation napkin was still warm in my hand when the music swelled again, trying to dissolve the moment. But it didn't. People kept glancing at me over champagne flutes, murmuring in small knots. Somewhere across the room, A journalist from the Daily Ledger was already typing furiously into her phone. I could almost feel the ripple of my name threading its way into tomorrow's headlines. Liam didn't walk away. He lingered, a glass of something dark in his hand, eyes tracking me through the crowd. It wasn't a casual look. It was the kind you give a chessboard after realizing the pawn just trapped your queen. I moved toward the terrace to breathe, my heels clicking against marble, but the whispers followed me like a shadow. Outside, the city lights burned cold and sharp against the night sky, and I thought of all the times I'd been dismissed, talked over, turned into a punchline for someone else's amusement. I thought I was walking away from a stunt. Instead, I felt the ground shifting under my own story. The door creaked behind me. Liam's silhouette stepped into the glow, his tie loosened, the chill air pulling his jacket tight against him. He didn't speak right away, just stood there, watching me the way someone watches a storm roll in, half wary, half intrigued. And I realized with a pulse of adrenaline that he wasn't just here to finish what he'd started. He was here because he'd seen something in me he didn't expect, and he wasn't going to let it go. The terrace felt smaller with him there, the hum of the gala fading into a distant, muffled beat behind the glass. Liam stepped closer, his polished shoes soundless against the stone, until I could catch the faint trace of cedar and something darker, sharp like ink. "You don't scare easily," he said, voice low, not quite a challenge, not quite a compliment. I kept my gaze on the skyline, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing how his words curled under my skin. "I've been underestimated my entire life," I replied, steady but quiet. "It's tiring." He tilted his head, studying me, and I felt the weight of his attention like a hand pressed between my shoulder blades. "Maybe they just don't know what you're capable of," he murmured, and for a second I couldn't tell if he was talking about the room or himself. The distance between us shrank until the city lights blurred into a halo around his face. My pulse betrayed me, quickening, but my feet stayed planted. This wasn't the place to fall into anyone's gravity, not after tonight. "You should go back in," I said, my voice more brittle than I meant it to be. His eyes flickered, like I'd just given him a puzzle piece he didn't expect. Instead of leaving, he leaned against the railing beside me, hands in his pockets, like we had all the time in the world. "Not until I know why you really did it," he said softly, the question lingering in the cold night air, refusing to be ignored. I almost laughed, but the sound stayed locked behind my teeth. "You think everything has a hidden motive," I said, turning to face him fully now. His eyes, too calm, too searching, caught mine, and for a dangerous moment, I forgot that every second here was a risk. The truth was tangled. I couldn't hand it to him without unraveling myself in front of someone who could use it. "Sometimes people do things because they're right," I added, though the edge in my tone betrayed the fact that it wasn't the full story. Liam didn't look convinced. His gaze drifted to my hand, still faintly trembling from earlier, and I caught the faint crease in his brow. Concern or calculation, I couldn't tell. A gust of wind lifted the hem of my dress, brushing it against his leg, and the closeness felt like an unspoken line I wasn't ready to cross. "I'll find out," he said, not as a threat, but as if it were inevitable. My chest tightened. Behind the glass doors, the room shimmered with laughter and champagne. But out here, the air felt heavier, loaded with something neither of us had the courage or foolishness to name. He stepped back at last, not breaking eye contact until the very moment he slipped inside, disappearing into the crowd. I stayed by the railing, my reflection faint in the glass, wondering if I'd just dodged danger or invited it in. Somewhere deep down, I knew the answer wouldn't stay hidden for long, and that he'd be the one to uncover it. The shift from the cool night air to the golden warmth of the gala was almost dizzying. Chatter swelled around me, punctuated by the clink of crystal and the swell of a live quartet in the corner. Dresses shimmered like poured champagne under the chandeliers, and the air was thick with the scent of orchids and ambition. I moved through it quietly, careful to keep my smile in place, though the pulse in my neck still raced from my encounter with Liam. At the far end of the room, A small crowd had formed around a display, a glass pedestal showcasing a rare, jewel-studded fountain pen, the kind meant for signatures that changed lives. My steps faltered. That pen was supposed to be locked away in my apartment, not here, under the watchful eyes of people who'd pay fortunes just to touch it. I drew closer, every muscle tensing, my heels clicking softly against the marble. A woman in a crimson gown leaned toward a man beside her and murmured something, her gaze flicking briefly, too briefly, toward me. The skin between my shoulder blades prickled. I realized then that this wasn't an accidental display. Someone had placed the pen here for a reason, and in this room full of smiles sharpened like knives, nothing was ever innocent. My hand itched to snatch it back, to hide it before it became a conversation, or worse, a transaction. But moving too quickly would draw exactly the kind of attention I couldn't afford. I forced my breathing steady, eyes scanning for whoever had orchestrated this little stage, because I knew one thing. The moment they saw me looking, the game would truly begin. I didn't have to wait long. From across the room, a slow ripple of motion parted the crowd, like silk being drawn through fingers, and there he was. Adrian Blackwell, the CEO whose empire seemed to stretch over every square foot of this city skyline, was walking straight toward the display. His tuxedo was cut to perfection, the kind that whispered old money and absolute control. The crowd seemed to tilt toward him, as if pulled by gravity. I stood frozen, pulse thundering, watching as his eyes found mine before he even reached the pedestal. That gaze, sharp, unreadable, skimmed over me like he was taking inventory. Then, without breaking eye contact, he reached for the pen. The room quieted in subtle waves, conversations stalling as people realized something was happening. He rolled the pen between his fingers, examining it like it was a curious little artifact, before looking back at me with the faintest curve to his lips. "Interesting place for something so personal," he said, his voice low but carrying easily over the muted music. My stomach nodded. This wasn't just a coincidence. He knew it was mine, and he wanted everyone else to know it too. Adrien didn't hand the pen back or place it neatly in its case. He slipped it into his jacket pocket, like a man claiming a prize. "Walk with me," he said simply, before turning toward the terrace without checking if I'd follow. The eyes of half the room burned into my back, waiting to see if I would. I inhaled once, slow and deliberate, and stepped after him. The terrace was quieter, but the city roared below, cars threading through streets like veins of light, the night air cool against my flushed skin. Adrien stood at the railing, his back to me, the pen in his hand catching the glow of the skyline. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he turned the pen slowly between his fingers, the metal glinting like it was something dangerous. "Do you know what people here will think when they see me with this?" he asked finally, not turning around. My voice felt caught in my throat. "That it's yours," I said. He chuckled, low and deliberate. "Exactly. And they'll wonder why." His gaze shifted over his shoulder, locking with mine. No warmth, but not cold either. Just a strange, heavy interest. He stepped closer, closing the space until I could catch the faint scent of his cologne. Cedar and something sharper, like rain on metal. "You don't look like someone who leaves pieces of themselves lying around for strangers to find," he murmured. I could feel the weight of his attention, as if he were peeling away layers I'd kept hidden for years. "So tell me, was this an accident or an invitation?" His question hung between us like a blade, too dangerous to answer lightly. Somewhere inside, I knew this was no ordinary conversation, no polite gala chatter. This was a move in a game I hadn't agreed to play, but one I was suddenly already in. My fingers curled against the cool stone of the railing. "Maybe," I said, meeting his stare head-on. The faintest shadow of a smile touched his lips. "Then I'll treat it like one." The final toast was minutes away, and the atmosphere inside had shifted. Laughter louder, music richer, the kind of crescendo that made people forget they were being watched. I stood near the edge of the crowd, my heart beating out of rhythm, the pen no longer in my clutch, but somewhere on Adrien's person. He hadn't given it back. From across the room, he was a dark silhouette framed by gold light, speaking with two board members, his hand in his pocket like he owned every second of this night. And maybe he did. My thoughts ran in tight circles. Why hadn't he exposed me? Why hadn't he asked for something in return yet? When his gaze finally found me, it wasn't casual. It was a deliberate draw, pulling me closer without a single word. The crowd seemed to part in subtle currents, and I found myself walking toward him as if the decision was already made. He stepped forward at the same time, closing the gap until we stood in the eye of the gala storm. "Stay," he said, his voice low enough to be swallowed by the music, but heavy enough to anchor me to the floor. It wasn't a request, and the strange part was, I didn't want it to be. The toast began, crystal glasses lifted, and the room turned toward the stage. Adrien didn't. His eyes stayed on me, the pen now in his hand again, balanced between his fingers like a promise or a threat. "We'll talk after," he murmured, before slipping it into my palm with a slow precision that made my breath catch. The metal felt warmer now, as if it had been carrying his intent the whole time. The applause for the toast was still echoing when Adrien leaned in, his voice slipping beneath the noise like a current. "Do you know what happens when you accept something from me?" My fingers tightened instinctively around the pen, its weight suddenly heavier than gold. "I didn't accept it," I replied, though the words felt weaker once they left my mouth. He gave a quiet laugh, the kind that wasn't entirely amused. "You're holding it, Hana. That's enough." My name on his lips was deliberate, shaping the air between us in a way that drew every nerve taut. The crowd began to disperse toward the dance floor, couples drifting away in silk and black tie, but we stayed rooted in the same spot. A few people glanced our way, curious, suspicious, maybe even envious. I caught sight of the woman in the crimson gown from earlier, her eyes narrowing before she turned sharply toward the bar. Adrien's gaze followed mine, then came back to me with something almost like warning. "She's not your problem," he said, though it sounded more like yet. My pulse thudded against the pen, against his unspoken challenge. "And you are?" I asked before I could stop myself. The corner of his mouth curved, not a full smile, but something sharper. "I'm your opportunity." He stepped back just far enough for the absence of his presence to feel like a pull. "Decide quickly, Hana. Opportunities don't linger." Then he turned toward the exit, disappearing into the soft shadows beyond the ballroom, leaving me with a choice burning hotter than the champagne still in my glass. The ballroom felt suddenly too bright, too loud, every laugh and clink of glass a distraction from the thundering in my chest. I stared at the pen in my hand, its surface still warm, the faint scent of his cologne clinging to it like a ghost. My mind replayed his words. Opportunities don't linger. Over and over until they no longer sounded like advice, but a countdown. Somewhere near the bar, the woman in crimson was watching me again, her expression sharp enough to cut. She wasn't hiding it now. Whatever this was, she was part of it. A slow unease slid through me, mingling with a pulse of something I hated to name. Curiosity. If I left now, I could disappear into the night, keep my life intact and my secret safe. But the image of Adrien stepping into the shadows tugged at me like an unspoken dare. I slipped the pen into my clutch, its weight anchoring me to a decision I hadn't made yet. The music swelled as a new song began, couples filling the floor in a swirl of silk and black. I turned toward the exit, my heels clicking against the marble, every step tightening the coil of anticipation in my chest. Just before I reached the door, a server brushed past, pressing a folded note into my palm. No name, no seal, just 4 words in precise black ink. "You've already chosen, Hana." My breath caught, the note trembling between my fingers. Somewhere behind me, I thought I heard that same low chuckle from earlier, closer than it should have been.